Welcome, everyone. My name is Lisa Vellers, and I'm one of the co-leads of the Project Management Community Group as part of Educause. For today's session, just a few basic things, reminders. We do want your participation, but if you could remain on mute and just to eliminate any background noise. We do have the live transcription feature enabled, so if you need that, please turn it on. If you've joined us by phone, please don't put us on hold. And if you have any questions or comments to add, you can feel free to raise your hand virtually or enter it in the chat. Today's session is being recorded and we'll share it out with the group. A few things before we get to our keynote speaker. Today's hosts are the project management co-chairs, myself and Jen Birch, and members of our steering committee, Ed Puckett, Carol Kiliani, and Jennifer Smith are all with us. I don't think I'm missing anyone else. For the agenda today, we just want to give you a few reminders about the Connect tips that we share, as well as our upcoming webinars for 2022. Also, then we'll hop right into our keynote presentation on accessibility considerations in project management. Then a reminder, if you're looking to get more involved, we do currently have an opening on our steering committee if you're interested in learning more. So just a reminder, we shared this last month, but we think it's important enough that we want to share it again. If you're going to be posting things, and this goes for our community group on the Connect platform in Educause or other community groups, it's a really great tool out there to use some hashtags. For instance, the one we've been using in our monthly meetings is PMCG meeting. And you'll notice that they can actually be turned into a link so you see everything. The one we've really also been promoting is job opportunity. Everybody uses that. You can quickly see all the job opportunities. If you aren't familiar with hashtags, all you do is you type that pound sign or a number sign and then start typing, and you can choose any from the list, or you can make one up on your own if there's not one that fits your posting. But just as a reminder, when you're posting in Connect, it makes your posts a lot more searchable and findable by others. Upcoming 2022 meeting dates. We are going to be meeting, we have April, May, and June. July, we typically take a break. If you, by chance, are interested in sharing something that you're passionate about, we'd love for you to be involved. We're always looking for new presenters. So please reach out to us if there's something or you can always nominate somebody else, maybe someone you've heard in another venue, something like that. But we are looking to build a slate, or if you just want to learn about something in particular, we can take care of trying to find a presenter if you share the topic with us. So our keynote speakers today are going to speak about accessibility considerations in project management. They are Gonzalo and Brandon from the University of Michigan. I'm going to let them tell you a little bit more about their positions there and their work with accessibility. I will hand it over to you now. Let me just stop sharing. Gonzalo, can you just share right over top of me? For some reason, I don't have my controls.
No, I can't unless you stop sharing first. But I can speak while you figure it out. My name is Gonzalo Silverio. I am a digital accessibility specialist at the University of Michigan. Both me and Brandon work in central IT. I wanted to preface this presentation with two thoughts. One of them, it's always a work in progress. We're presenting to you the ideal final version of what we're working towards. This is not how things are in reality. They never will be. So hopefully you're seeing Google Slides. Yes.
Yeah.
I already introduced myself, Brandon.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Testing audio.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I was worried for a second. Okay, everybody can hear me. Okay. My name is Brandon Werner. I also work with Gonzalo in the information technology as an accessibility analyst. Can we move to the next slide, the agenda?
Okay.
So today we're going to be talking about a few topics that you can see on this agenda. We'll be talking about first, what is specifically digital accessibility? Why is it important? Why do we need to implement digital accessibility into our daily practices and what we do for our jobs at these institutions? How do we integrate digital accessibility into the projects we work on and that we manage? And this is from when we both buy and develop technology, because the processes, while similar, are slightly different. And we'll also talk about strategies for incorporating stakeholders, all the stakeholders, that's project managers, developers, folks at the vendor. Sometimes if it can even be users of the technology. There's a lot of stakeholders, as you all know, doing project management. Okay, next slide. This is kind of just a boundary slide for the first part of the presentation. Was digital accessibility? Next. Okay, so in this slide, we're talking about what is digital accessibility. So one thing that it is inclusive. By ensuring that we have things are accessible, we ensure that we include everybody, which is really important. Many universities, including us at the university, have DEI initiatives. By having our digital technology accessible, we provide equal access to employment, education, and e-commerce, which, at first glance, it may seem like universities only add, education. But when you think about it, I mean, we sell things, we sell books, and we sell swag. I mean, we also employ people. So really, even at universities, all three of those apply to us. Also, with social media taking off today, making connections, making friends, and then growth, it's almost essential today to have a LinkedIn profile. Some folks even have their own websites to host resumes, and making sure that all that is accessible is very important. I guess finally on this slide, we'll touch on the fact that accessibility really should be something that's a standard, something we'll touch on this a lot through the presentation, but something you want to be thinking of from the beginning of the process and not at the end. One of my colleagues, Jane, who works with us, always says, when you put a drinking fountain up, it's better to hang it at ADA height initially than to hang it at the wrong height and then later have to go and tear it out and remount it. It's a lot less work if you just mount it at the correct height from the beginning to meet the Americans with Disability Act guidelines. Next slide. So what does it involve? So number one is culture. We talked about this a little bit, but DEI initiatives are part of a culture that we want to enforce and promote at our university. And by, like I said in the past slide, implementing accessibility into that, we're really pushing that forward. So compliance with institutional policy. I'm sure some folks who are listening to this presentation today already have digital accessibility policies at their university. We're just about to the finish line of ours here at the University of Michigan, but we want to make sure we comply with those policies. Also, it's the law, the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 mandate that we provide equal access and equitable access to folks with disabilities that choose to use these things and who need to use these things at our universities. Also, project management practice is part of this. It's really important, which is we'll get into later, but making sure this is successful really requires that we have these repeatable processes. I think that's what we found, is that by implementing repeatable processes for implementing projects, that's what really makes all this a success. Next slide. So this slide you can have, if you implement it properly, digital accessibility can have a win. Your employees, your and your folks who are getting educated, all are really happy. Everything's great. Your people who come to the websites, maybe it's even retirees, alumni. We're then making things accessible for everybody. We did have a list of folks who had been sued, but we decided to take it out because, in reality, it could be any of us. I mean, I think everybody in this room has something at their university that's inaccessible, and it's not ideal, but it's being honest to admit that. And I think the goal should be to move forward and work on remediating those things. Okay, next slide. The next part of our presentation, accessibility in projects. Next. Okay, so next I'll talk a little bit about a suboptimal project model. We have a kind of a train stop thing here to kind of show the process. And basically what it has is, the first we have accessibility check-in, and then the next stop we have development or RFP, and the next step we have done. And this involves accessibility very late in the process, which is kind of what I talked about earlier, wanting to avoid. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, so what happens when you ask about accessibility at the end of the process, the implementation process of a new digital accessibility project, as was sort of shown with the train stops in the last slide? Number one, it's increased risk. Also, I'll take this opportunity to define risk. We defined risk as the probability that someone with a disability will encounter a barrier when using the product. There's two factors in that. Number one, the actual probability that someone with a disability will be using this, and then two, the probability that they will encounter a barrier. I mean, if, for example, a product is accessible, but then there's maybe an accessibility barrier and an admin panel that's only used by one user at the entire university, it's probably not as likely that someone will run into a barrier. Obviously, we want to avoid all barriers, but we have to think about risk. Just because we have limited resources and we want to prioritize where we're going to have the greatest benefits. So another thing that is, if you implement accessibility at the end, you have to choose between a slip timeline or a defective product, because you'll be frantically trying to fix all the accessibility barriers that you didn't fix throughout the process. Okay, next slide. Factor in accessibility. Obviously, it reduces the risk since you involve the accessibility team from the beginning. You'll be able to implement the product much more on time and not be defective. So you'll get the best of both worlds. It'll be equitable and more compliant than if you had waited till the end to ask about accessibility. Also, everybody learns something. As you'll see when we describe our processes later, there are many opportunities throughout the process where training and learning is integrated. And if you ask at the end, then none of that training and learning gets to happen. Also, we all become friends. That's always good.
Hey, Brandon, can I jump in for a sec and just point out something? This is Jen Birch. I don't do this perfectly myself, but I do know that one of my favorite experiences working with your team has been this idea that, we typically look at it as more of, unfortunately, I think a lot of people look at it as like red tape and bureaucracy. And when I've worked with your team earlier on, I've found that that's not the case at all. And instead, your team is really great at helping come up with sort of a roadmap for how to address things if we can't get it done perfectly the first time around. This idea that I think you're going to talk about here a little bit, where it's okay to be a little iterative if we need to. But it's not intended to be something that stops you or prevents you from moving forward. It's meant to be a better way of getting that successful criteria met.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. Also, if anyone has any questions, I don't care if you want to interrupt me and ask a question, that's fine, because I know you might forget it. And the thing I'll add too is by making something more accessible, you should also know that you're making it generally more compliant for mobile. Adding good structure to documents like tables, headings, all these things really helps mobile devices adjust the content to better fit the screen. I don't know if people have seen in like Apple's Pages recently, they added like a reader mode, and that's really, really big on these sorts of things. So by implementing accessibility, you're also making mobile better. Okay, so next slide, risk assessment. So we have a risk assessment. Again, risk is the likelihood that someone with a disability will bump into a barrier. And we rate the risk as high, medium, or low. And based on that risk, we have a slightly different path we take through these. We'll get into more train stops later, but we take a different path through these train stops, and there's a different number of them. So some of the questions we ask are, how many users are going to be using the product? Is it going to be used for coursework? Is there an accessible alternative? And also, are we replacing something that's accessible? Because if we're replacing something accessible with something inaccessible, that's bad. Can we provide an accommodation? And is it related to safety or security? Next slide. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about an engagement plan. So basically, an engagement plan, after we've gone through the risk assessment, so we've got some train stops up that have risk assessment and then engagement plan. After we've gotten through the risk assessment, the accessibility team kind of sits down and thinks about a couple factors on how we're going to proceed with the project. We have those on this slide. What's the degree of risk? That's obviously the big one. Project realities and processes. Who are you dealing with? Is it like a development team in the university that's like a tugboat, or is it more like an enterprise vendor that's more like a slow moving aircraft carrier, difficult to steer type thing. Data from previous collaborations with the vendor, that's really important. We'll get into this a little bit more later, but it's something that's very important. I actually think Anthal is going to maybe speak about that, or me. Can't remember which one of us does. Okay, next slide. Okay, so next we'll talk about the exit. This is at the end of the process. We do a little bit of self-reflection within the team, like what could we do better? Oftentimes we'll also include people we worked with, like project managers. We write documentation, and documentation comes in many forms, but I think the most important documentation is probably that which we prepare for folks who, if there is a barrier, or if there's a feature we think folks with disabilities may find it helpful to have documented, we create a KB article, or we create a something we can give to the help desk that they can then provide to users if folks write in and chat. Sometimes we put information up on our website. We're still trying to work out a process around that, which information goes in the KB, what articles, and which goes on the websites, but I'm sure it's like anything, it'll eventually fall into place and these things will become more clear. Also important documentation is documentation for us about in the future, how we can test this thing. What is needed from us to keep the product up and going from an accessibility standpoint for the monitoring. Also, we talk about, I think I mentioned the process improvement already, but training recommendations, we're working in our institution to develop a variety of accessibility training resources, some for like project managers, some for developers. I guess it's not really our job to train the vendors, but sometimes we provide them training and suggest that they check it out, and it's obviously up to them whether they want to do so. Okay, next I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Gonzalo, who's going to talk a little about procurement.
Hi there. Any questions thus far? It's a bit abstract. We'll try to add a few stories here and there to illuminate certain concepts, but feel free to interrupt us at any point with any question. Again, the first step is always a risk assessment. There's so many hours in the day, and there's just 2 of us. The second step in procurement would be issuing an RFP, and we have standard boilerplate language that gets included by the procurement folks, and also a vendor questionnaire that's required. It's only 10 questions, and it allows us to take a look at what is the culture of the vendor, not as much about the product, but how do they operate? How do they think about these things? And then we also ask them for standardized compliance documentation, such as VPAT, or voluntary product accessibility template, I think. Then we take a look at the compliance documentation. And this is sort of an interesting exercise. Compliance documentation bears in a large number of cases, I should say, not much of a relationship between the documentation and the actual accessibility of the product. It's again, it helps to winnow down vendors if there are multiple submissions for an RFP. And we take care of the evaluation in high-risk cases, and we have an instrument that we provide to project owners so that they can do their own evaluation of compliance documentation in low-risk cases. All of these documents that we mentioned are linked to at the very end of the slide deck. The next step would be actual product review. And again, there's a lot of flexibility as to what steps take place when, but we're assuming a high-risk purchase in this case. We review it against the technical standard. We depend on the project team to provide us with test cases, identities, test cases based on roles and identities for the same. And low-risk adoptions, we have an instrument that the project team itself can use to evaluate the product. And finally, the exit phase, we updated a vendor scorecard. We keep track of vendors and that informs future projects, as well as things that were left hanging, things that the vendor sign on the contract that we're going to deliver. In the University of Michigan, it might be different elsewhere, but there's a moment when the project is done and the product becomes a service run by a different team or a different person, the service manager. Super important in the exit phase to hand over to the service manager any information that is relevant for the accessibility of the product service at this point. We have a debrief, and again, we'll offer training depending on what we found during the whole process. In the contract phase, assume I didn't say anything about the exit phase. And the contract phase, we use the data from our review. We debrief the vendor, we debrief the project team. And what matters in the contract phase is flexibility. The end goal remains the same. We need to reduce risk, we need to be compliant. So there's a lot of different things we can include in the contract. We work with the procurement team. Require issues be fixed before the service is deployed, require that things be fixed within a given timeline. And occasionally, if it's a really high-risk project, we actually bind the vendor to fix issues that come up later that we never notice. Brandon?
Okay, thank you. So next, we're going to talk about how the process differs for developments. Are we on slide 22 now?
Don't know.
Okay, this is the one that should have the standard model revisited, I think.
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, I'm slightly blind, so I'm relying on Gonzalo. Anyway, standard model revisited. So basically, we're revisiting that inadequate model we talked about before, which is an accessibility review of a development project, and then done, which, as you can see from what Gonzalo has talked about and what I've talked about, how all the benefits that we've mentioned from these integration points, all those are lost when you go for this model. Okay, so next slide, we're going to talk about one of the things that's different. We have these train stops up again. Risk assessment is the first one, and design review is the second one when you have a development. And in the design review, we have the opportunity to review wireframes and requirements. And if you know, really, when you think about it, if you want to implement accessibility in a cheap way for things you're building, I mean, this is a great time to do it. I mean, you know, annotating a PDF doesn't cost anything of a wireframe except someone's time. And, you know, no code's been written yet. You know, no complex workflows have been built based on the requirements. But when we look at the requirements and we modify the wireframes, we can sometimes, you know, modify requirements to make, you know, and workflows to make things more accessible before the project has even started being developed. So this is really the time to do this. So next slide. So we still have the train stops up. We have, or again, as a reminder, the risk assessment and the design review. And next we have an iterative process that takes place over and over again. Learn, mediate, review. So basically what happens is the accessibility team will do a review, and then we teach the developers about problems that we found. Then the developers fix those issues, and then we review them again. So it starts with, you know, review. Then we teach the developers, you know, then the developers fix the problem, and then we review it again. So it kind of goes around in a circle, as you can kind of see from the illustrations on this slide. Next slide, 25, example of the process. That last slide was a bit abstract, so we decided we'd give an example on this next slide. So let's assume, for example, that Gonzalo and I were doing a review of a website, and we found some links on a website that didn't have text; they only had images. So a screen reader user like me is tabbing through, and it says link, 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 and then you don't really know where any of those goes, and then you click on one, and then for me, since I can't see it, I clicked on the one that empties my bank account or sends it who knows where, or delete my account, who knows what happens, but you get the idea. Having link labels is very important. So then we go to the developer and we say, hey, there's all these links that don't have text. We'd like you to label them. So then, the developer labels the link. So now I can click the link that says, send money from Gonzalo's bank account to Brandon's bank account, rather than the one that says send money from Brandon's bank account to Gonzalo's bank account. He's got to make sure you're clicking the right one there. And if they're not labeled, I won't know which one I'm clicking. So next, the developer remediates. So the developer fixes the issues, and then we review it again. Next slide. Okay, so this is kind of one of our final slides. We just wanted to sort of define the roles here. So for project management and procurement teams, there's a few things that we ask that can help us. Follow the accessibility advising template. Again, linked at the end of the presentation are all these documents. And basically what the advising template is, I'll just give a quick description of it here. We have one advising template for procurements and RFPs, and we have another one for development. And then those are subdivided into two more for high and medium risk projects and low risk. And basically it's just a document that guides everybody involved, but especially the project manager through the steps we want to take to get this through the review. Again, it's a set of these sort of train stops you can think of in the document. What steps do we go through to work this to completion in the proper way? Then we asked the project managers to schedule training for staff based on needs. This is really mostly in the cases of a development likely, making sure that developers get the training they need to make things more accessible in the future. What do we ask of developers? We ask them to follow accessibility guidelines. And we ask them to, take trainings that we provide to them to learn accessibility guidelines. Accessibility team, that's us. Verify the compliance documentation. That's in high and medium risk projects. I think Gonzalo talked about this, but I'll just mention it one more time. In low risk projects, we will ask the project team to review the compliance documentation. We provide an engagement plan. Again, we evaluate the risk and we provide the advising template, and we tell, as the process goes, we guide everybody through the process. That's the engagement plan. We provide a product review in medium and high risk cases. And we provide advising to procurement on the contract. I think ultimately in the end, we would like to move more of that off to procurement so that we don't have to be involved quite as much, because again, the cycles for things like that are extremely limited. It takes a lot of time, and we'd like to get a situation in place where procurement is able to, maybe ask us for help occasionally, but really kind of work through these contract negotiations without the accessibility advice. That's the goal. Our next slide is questions, but before we end, I do want to say there were a lot of graphics in this presentation, and Gonzalo and I tried to describe them along the way, but we have our email address, itsaccessibility@umich.edu. If you have any questions about any of the drawings in this, please feel free to reach out to us. If you could not see or chose not to look at this presentation today, feel free to, and I should mention that there's a dash in there. It's its-accessibility@umich.edu. That's all we have. Unless Gonzalo, you have anything to add, we're happy to take any questions from folks in the audience.
And nothing to add here except our thanks for this opportunity.
Any questions? Feel free to unmute and you can ask if you'd like.
Not a question. This is Ed. I was just trying to help out, but I did hear it was its-accessibility@umich.edu.
No,
Yep.
it's actually got the dot in
It's-
there.
Does
Dot?
it?
Dot,
Okay.
yeah.
So I was trying to help out and post.
Oh,
that in the
thanks. I
chat.
don't know why I said dash. My bad.
Yeah. So I posted what the correction I thought was to the chat. Everyone ignore that. Listen to Jennifer.
Oh, I love that, Ed. Can you do that more often? Just
Yes, I can.
listen to Jennifer. I'm going to use that for my projects from now on too. Just listen to Jennifer.
For a small fee, I'm going to say this, and it's going to get put out there on YouTube. For a small fee, I'll call in for anyone's meeting in this community group, and I'll say that.
So Brandon and Gonzalo, I know I was having like a little bit of a conversation with someone in our chat window here. And it seems like, and others on the call here, I'd be interested in hearing, we're really good at doing sort of our due diligence on accessibility during a procurement or purchasing activities, but not necessarily during development.
This is Gonzalo. That'll depend. The issue with purchases and procurement is that they tend to become a project, as we understand projects, more frequently than development. Development can happen under the radar and not come to the project management office's radar. So yeah, that is a work in progress. Some units here at Michigan in ITS are excellent at getting us involved and a lot of fun to work with. Others are laboring outside of our attention for many different reasons, none of them bad, just the way things have always been done. And it, again, I mentioned at the beginning, this is a work in progress. We're presenting an idealized process, but one that we work towards more and more. Brandon mentioned this, but it's worth mentioning again. The fact that this is federal law is absolutely inconsequential in most people's minds. When we have a local policy, that is bound to change. Does that address the question?
It does. Yeah.
The thing I'll answer about developments too. I think when you have, because the question was, how do you involve accessibility in developments? Is that right?
Yeah. As I think most institutions, from what I'm hearing, are they know to do a little bit, or at least they know on the surface, I need to make sure that there's a VPAT. I don't know how much or to what extent they do a full deep dive evaluation before purchasing anything, like during an RFP style process.
So I think one of the big differences that we didn't talk about between a purchase and really, I would say, really in all cases, we have found the most effective communications with vendors are when there's one of each of the following at the table in the meeting. Someone from the project team at the vendor who can talk to you about timelines, and someone from the development team who can interface with the accessibility team to figure out what's needed and ask questions about the reported issues. Again, we provide a summary that we provide two things. A summary that goes to project team leaders to give them the scope of what needs to be done, and then a more technical project review that's geared toward developers. I would say as you hire, people for an accessibility team, or you delegate accessibility tasks, think about that. You really need both those skills. Someone who is really able to think about and communicate the scope of the information and manage the project on the accessibility team. And you also need someone technical who can interface with the developers. You need that bridge to happen for both. Internally at the university, it becomes especially important that you can interface with the developers, because when you're working with a vendor, it would be expected that you can provide a high level overview, and that internally developers will do research on the technology that they use and get the product fixed. You're highly unlikely. I guess what I'm saying is it's not very likely you'll be pulled into a development session with the vendor. However, when you're working with folks at the university, it's a much higher likelihood that you'll be pulled into a development session where literally folks are, and this has happened to us numerous times, where folks are actually, you're on a Zoom call and they're deploying things in real time, and you're testing and providing advice, and sometimes more research has to be done. But those both will require technical knowledge, but those that are internal to the university working on developments that happen internally are much more likely to require technical knowledge from the accessibility team, because it's our job at that point to do the accessibility research, not the vendors. I hope that answers the question too. Provide some more insight. Does that
Any
help,
other
John? I'm sorry, someone started to talk.
Was that you, Lisa?
Yep, I was just asking if there was any other questions, but you can feel free to answer, Brandon, if that helped.
I got a question. Which one of us is more boring, Gonzalo or me?
Oh, silence.
Now,
Nice. Thanks,
Yes.
Murray.
I like the
Yeah, but-
presentation. In fact, one of the comments you made at the beginning was the thing, summarizing the thing about accessibility is if you implement it right, if you follow the principles and the concepts behind accessibility, it's a win for everyone because information is presented cleaner, information is presented better on multiple sites, and it just the benefits continue to pay off. And I think so many times it's labeled as this is something we're doing for a certain set of people. No, not really. It applies for everyone. A primary example is you put in the buttons for the doors or the automatic opening doors for people that are in wheelchairs. Well, that also benefits parents that are pushing strollers. So it has benefits all the way around.
Another thing that I'll mention is that I think it's really important too. And one of the things I'll be honest, we've struggled with a lot is getting feedback from users on what we're doing. Is it helping them? I'll give an example of something I think is a consequence of folks not asking for feedback. I once saw a vending machine. It was a touchscreen vending machine, and they're providing the touchscreen was up high, and they were providing wheelchair access by having a sort of a compartment that you had to reach way back into, and then a little tiny trackball the size of a marble to move a little cursor around on the screen, and then tiny little left and right buttons to click. And I just looked at that and said, I don't know, a lot of folks, who are in wheelchairs may, also have, a mobility impairment in their hands. And even me as someone who has full use of my hands, I could barely operate that trackball. And, being in a wheelchair put you at a bad angle to operate it. And I think this is the consequence of why it's really important to reach out to our communities and say is what we're doing, and especially after we receive a complaint, reaching back out and say, did what we do resolve your complaint? Is what we're doing helping? And when we really struggle with that, it's a tough thing because you don't want to, folks with disabilities are already busy enough and it takes them longer to accomplish tasks. So you don't want to ask them to do testing for you, but in the same sense, getting feedback from them once in a while is extremely helpful. So I think coming up with that balance is really important. And that really fits into the monitoring process, I would say, after the process is complete. So you, as part of the monitoring process, you ask folks, is what we're doing, we decided and we kind of thought this was accessible. Do you find it accessible? Do you find the documentation that we wrote with workarounds and suggestions helpful? Questions like that can be really good to ask the folks with disabilities on your campus.
Brandon, what are some best practices for doing sort of those evaluations with your stakeholders and users on, what sort of training they might need? Because you obviously don't want to wait until the very end to figure that out. Would that be something that you would include in your early on stakeholder analysis?
Yeah, that's right. But again, what kind of training folks needs is kind of determined along the way. For example, if we see compliance documentation where everything is passed, then obviously, the vendor needs a little, probably needs a little bit of guidance from us on, how to prepare their VPAT better in the future. A voluntary product accessibility template with some errors is much better than one with no errors, because if it has no errors, you almost know they didn't test it. Training for developers, as we sort of talk with developers over those accessibility issues, we sort of get a sense of what they might need as we work with them. And that's why I said having those two people, at the table talking to the accessibility team, both the project manager and the developer. And then, obviously, as we go along through the process, we sort of try to think about what we might be able to do to help project managers to train them on our processes. Sometimes it's on those non-technical accessibility analyses for low-risk projects. But I would say it kind of is a thing that gets determined as we go along the way. as opposed to right at the beginning in the engagement process, because at that point, we haven't really interacted with the stakeholders yet. So I would say we're not quite sure what they need. Do you have anything to add to that, Gonzalo? It's kind of I'd say a tricky one.
Yeah, something that we're not very good at, possibly because of structural reasons, is training leadership. We found ourselves in the position of having like one day to review a major acquisition. And the reason we only had one day to do so is because people in position of leadership determined this thing had to be bought right away. How to carry the message across so that project managers are not put in the difficult position of having to obey a diktat and at the same time going through a process that means more equitable IT for everybody is something that we need to work on.
Yeah, I'll add to what Gonzalo said by saying, unfortunately, it's acquisitions, not acquisitions, or acquisition. It's a plural thing. Unfortunately, I'm sort of ashamed to admit that, but it's happened in multiple cases, and it's happened for multiple high-profile purchases. Luckily for us, we've just been lucky, but all of them have happened to be accessible. But again, we just got lucky.
Anyway, bringing it back to training, we can train developers. We can point project managers towards best practices. We can even suggest to vendors things they might do to improve their stance, but we can't do very much with leadership. Suggestions very much welcome.
One thing I'm not sure that I'll add about training, Gonzalo, did we link our, if we haven't done it, we should in the resources. Did we link we have a course in Canvas that we've made that's accessible to everybody on the internet that you are welcome to take a look at. It's low fidelity videos and gives some examples of some of the training that we put together and provide to people. Do we have that? If we don't, Gonzalo, we can add it to the resources afterwards.
Yeah, I'll add it.
Okay, and it's the Google slides we're going to share. So everybody will always have the latest up-to-date copy. And again, if you have suggestions for training videos that we could add, I mean, we're always open to suggestions, and it's its.accessibility. I'll get it right this time.
Any other questions?
This has been the theme for today, is very silent, quiet, still not quite recovered from the daylight savings time. It's okay. Jump in.
I'll jump in, Jennifer. There was a comment made about struggling to get feedback. And back in the day when I was running the university's website, I'd struggle as well. I would be very formal about setting up sessions and scheduling time with students and having them come to the office. And more often than not, with their busy schedules, or they thought it was a good idea at the time, but then didn't want to show up to that testing session. I flipped it around, and I would start bringing the equipment to them. And so I would walk around on a day that I had nothing to do, which I tried to make time for that because these tests were important. I would just walk around with the laptop and have a set of tasks ready for them to complete, 2 or 3 tasks at the most, and just watch them perform those tasks using the website or the application that we were trying to test. And I would keep going until I would get 10 results, and then I'd stop. And I would do that by walking the halls. We have study areas spread throughout the campus. I'd hit those areas, hit the patio cafe on our campus. So I'm wondering if that same principle can be applied when you're trying to determine how accessible a particular product is. I think more often than not, students that have screen readers and things like that already have their equipment right there and are very adept at using them. So it's just a matter of getting them to go to that particular application or site right then and there and just running it through a quick user test.
It's interesting because in product development, one of the things that you really want to do the most is carve out time to do exactly like you said, Ed, spend the time pounding the pavement, getting to your users. If you can afford doing large focus groups, by all means do that. But if you can't, then you just go to the people and get that information.
I wouldn't even make it focus groups. It would be, sometimes it would turn into that because at a lunch table, there's 3 or 4 students sitting there. But I would find that the one-on-ones and the small groups were very helpful, especially if I was going to them, because chances are that's where they're going to use the application. They're not going to use it that effectively if they come to a user lab because their stuff isn't where they want it to be on the computer. But they will, and so there they are in their natural environment. Sounds like a Wildlife America show, but there they are in their natural environment, and they're willing and able to do that right there because you haven't made it something to do in the future or something to put on an already clogged calendar. And it's just really kind of, once I started that casual process, it actually did 2 things. 1, I got better data, and 2, it was just really fun to start interacting with the students where they were.
You get a better understanding of how they're using it too.
And what their issues are outside of just your particular technology that you're trying to proof. You learn about what's important to them on campus.
And I don't know if this is the case across other university and campuses, but one of the challenges that we have is that the majority of our product managers or service owners are doing other things. Like they're wearing so many hats that they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to go out there and do just that. That's just kind of a weird shift that we're seeing, and I don't see that going away anytime soon. Higher ed is contracting.
Yeah, I agree with that. We don't do product, when they say things are moving from project management to product development, we don't do justice to that concept because we don't have dedicated product teams that can focus and rally around a particular product.
Well, and one of my colleagues in the University of Michigan, PMO, is on the call here, and she can attest to the fact that while it's an aspirational item, and it does happen sometimes, a lot of times we get stuck on those things, and the project manager doesn't get to go away.
No, and I this is Jennifer Murray at the University of Michigan. I worked with the team here on the call, and one of the things too with project management is that accessibility is an ongoing thing too, especially with vendor management. And so it's not like the project's successful, we launched it, we bought it. No, it needs to be an ongoing engagement with Gonzalo and Brendan and that team to always keep your vendor's always going to change. And it's not quite at product management methodology type in our area yet, but hopefully someday.
Goals. Got lots and lots of goals.
Well, it goes back to what Gonzalo says. That the reality statement is what we're talking about is where we should be. It may not be realized today, but we make steps toward that. And one day we will get there.
Ooh, that's a good way to come full circle there, Ed.
I'm about circles. Circles are good.
Yeah, I wanted to, this is Gonzalo again. We haven't talked about friction. This does introduce friction. We have to be honest about that. But we always try to minimize the amount of friction introduced. And with a little bit of friction, we might get less unpleasant results.
It's like sandpaper.
Yes.
You're hurting the wood, but at the end of the day, the wood becomes smoother. So.
Like that.
Well, thank you, Gonzalo and Brandon. I'm going to hop back to the community group presentation. We will be sharing Brandon and Gonzalo's presentation along with the recording of this session soon on the Project Management Community Group Connect site. Just a reminder, I mentioned at the beginning, if you're interested in getting more involved, we are looking for a steering committee, a new steering committee member. We meet about every 2 weeks and plan sessions like these. Please feel free to reach out to myself or Jen. Our contact information is right on the Connect site. If you have any questions or you'd like to volunteer for this or something else with the group. Just a reminder, our next meeting is scheduled for April 20th at 1 o'clock. Oop, and it's not going to be accessibility considerations and projects. We're aiming for probably a session on small college project management, but we're still working on confirming those speakers. So if you happen to be at a small college or university and you'd like to talk about your project management office or your project management processes, please reach out to me as I'm finalizing a panel for that group. Just a reminder, all of our resources can be found on the Educause Connect site, connect.educause.edu.